They wrote his name in the margin, then crossed it out. They described his face in ledgers, then locked the pages away. What frightened them was not his beauty, but what it revealed. Before we continue, subscribe to our channel to complete 1,000 subscribers and tell in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it. The records begin in the low country, where fog rolled in from the marshes and settled against the timbered walls of plantations like a held breath. In 1839, Southern records were not meant to preserve truth. They were instruments of order, inked to confirm ownership, prices, yields, and bloodlines. Yet even within those rigid columns, something unusual appears, a hesitation in the clerk's hand, a description that lingers longer than necessary. The subject was an enslaved man whose name was written differently each time, as if no single word could contain him. He was noted first as property, then as an anomaly, then quietly as a problem. The plantation where he arrived lay along a river whose surface reflected lantern light like fractured stars. Cypress trees leaned inward, their roots drinking from black water, their branches whispering to one another when the wind passed through. It was here that overseers began to notice how visitors paused when he crossed the yard, how conversations slowed, how eyes followed him longer than custom allowed. Beauty was not a virtue in this world, it was a disturbance. It bent attention away from hierarchy and toward something unnamed and unsettling. Auction records from Charleston mention him only briefly, yet the language shifts around his description. Words usually reserved for fine horses or imported fabrics appear, polished and careful. His age is estimated, his strength assessed, but then the clerk adds a line that does not belong. He is described as striking, uncommon, possessed of features that draw notice without effort. Such observations were dangerous. To record them was to admit vulnerability in a system built on absolute control. Those who worked closest to him left no direct testimony, but their silence is its own archive. In personal letters preserved by descendants, references appear to unease, to households unsettled by something that could not be disciplined. One woman writes of dreams disturbed by faces she cannot name. Another complains of servants lingering in doorways, distracted from their tasks. No one says his name outright. Instead, they circle it careful, as if writing it might invite consequences. Southern society in 1839 understood beauty as a form of power, and power was meant to flow in only one direction. To acknowledge it in an enslaved body threatened the careful fictions that upheld plantations, courts, and churches alike. Ministers preached order from pulpits built of pine and oak, their voices echoing beneath rafters darkened by smoke, yet even sermons could not erase what people had seen. When the man passed by, even prayer faltered for a moment. At night, the quarters fell quiet except for the river and the insects rising from the reeds. Lanterns dimmed, shadows stretched across packed earth, and stories traveled without words. Fear did not announce itself loudly. It crept in through glances, through doors left slightly ajar, through ledgers amended after midnight. Beauty, once observed, could not be unseen. It lingered like a fingerprint on glass. The archives show that within months ownership changed. The transfer is abrupt, lacking explanation. No illness, no insubordination, no economic reason recorded. Only a sudden relocation further inland, away from ports and visitors. Such movements were common, yet this one bears marks of haste. Signatures pressed too hard into the paper. Dates are corrected twice. Someone wanted distance, not profit. What follows grows murkier. County documents list him as labor, then omit him entirely. A census notation leaves a blank where his entry should be. In private account books, his labor is tallied without his name attached. It is as if he existed everywhere and nowhere at once, present in the work accomplished, absent from the official story. Historians later would note these gaps and wonder what compelled so many careful men to forget so deliberately. Oral histories collected generations later speak of a figure remembered in fragments. A face glimpsed by firelight, a voice never raised, a stillness that unsettled even the cruelest overseers. These recollections are unreliable, shaped by time and fear, yet they align in one way. They describe not rebellion, not escape, but attention that could not be commanded or withdrawn. In a society obsessed with classification, he resisted easy placement. He was neither myth nor miracle, yet he disturbed the order more deeply than either. His beauty was not celebrated. It was contained, redirected, buried beneath layers of paperwork and silence. That burial was incomplete. traces remain, smudged but persistent, in margins and memories. This story does not begin with violence, though violence framed every breath of that era. It begins instead with discomfort, with a system sensing a flaw within itself. The bizarre secret hinted at in Southern records is not what was done to him, but what could not be explained away. A moment when certainty wavered, when ink hesitated, when the past revealed its own fear. The second movement of the record unfolds farther from the coast, where the river narrows and the air loses its salt. Here plantations were older, their houses built low and wide, their timbers seasoned by decades of heat. The man whose presence unsettled Charleston was brought inland under a different name, one chosen for its plainness. In the surviving papers it appears abruptly, without explanation, as if he had always been there. This was how the system protected itself, by rewriting arrivals as inevitabilities. Those who first encountered him in this new place left fewer written traces, yet their routines changed in small but telling ways. Work schedules shifted to separate him from others. Tasks were reassigned without cause. A carpenter's journal mentions a delay because the yard was unfit for gathering, though no rain had fallen. Such evasions suggest a collective instinct to reduce exposure, to dull whatever drew attention toward him. Control was exercised not through chains alone, but through distance. The plantation's owner was a man known for order, for ledgers balanced to the penny and fields arranged with geometric care. His correspondence reflects irritation during this period, a sense that something remained unresolved. He writes of unrest without rebellion, of quiet that felt unnatural. In one letter he describes the evening air as heavy, though the season was mild. The description reads less like weather than atmosphere, as if the land itself resisted assimilation. At night the house lamps burned later than usual. Servants were dismissed early, corridors cleared, windows were shuttered despite the heat. The records do not say why, but later marginal notes indicate concerns about propriety, about appearances that could not be allowed to circulate. Beauty, once again, emerges as an unspoken hazard. It threatened not through action, but through presence, through the silent rearranging of gazes. Church attendance logs from the local parish show an anomaly. On Sundays, when he was listed among the congregation, sermons ran longer. The minister's language grew abstract, circling themes of temptation and humility. Parishioners recalled feeling watched, though no one could name the source. In a society where surveillance flowed downward, this reversal produced unease. The eyes of the enslaved were not meant to hold meaning. Whispers traveled along fence lines and through kitchens, carried by those whose labor placed them between worlds. These stories were not preserved verbatim, yet their echoes remain in later testimonies. They speak of a man who listened more than he spoke, whose stillness unsettled because it reflected others back to themselves. Such qualities were intolerable within a structure that demanded invisibility. The archival trail darkens further when illness appears in the household accounts. Not epidemics, but vague complaints, sleeplessness, nerves, remedies were purchased, consultations requested. None mention a cause. The timing, however, coincides with his arrival. Historians often caution against reading causation into coincidence, yet patterns insist on interpretation. The plantation seemed to react as a body might, registering stress without understanding its origin. Eventually, a solution was enacted. It was neither sale nor punishment, but reassignment. He was removed from visible labor and placed in work that left fewer witnesses. The fields gave way to storage rooms, the riverbank to enclosed spaces. This disappearance from daily sight marks a turning point. Where beauty could not be erased, it was hidden. Even hidden, traces persisted. Inventory lists include items attributed to his care, maintained with unusual precision, tools cleaned beyond necessity, spaces ordered with quiet exactness. These details, preserved unintentionally, suggest a presence that imposed calm rather than chaos. That calm, paradoxically, was the greater threat. It contradicted the narrative of disorder used to justify domination. Outside the plantation, rumors continued. Travelers remarked on an atmosphere difficult to describe, a sense that something was withheld. They could not name it, yet they felt it in the stillness of the yards, in the way conversations stalled. Such impressions rarely enter official history, but they shape it nonetheless, influencing decisions made without conscious acknowledgement. By the end of the decade, references to him grow scarce. Not because he was gone, but because the effort to contain his effect had succeeded on paper. Silence became policy. Names were omitted, descriptions shortened. What could not be controlled physically was disciplined through absence. This was the bizarre secret taking form, not as scandal, but as erasure, deliberate and incomplete, yet erasure leaves residue. The more carefully the records avoid him, the more conspicuous the gaps become. Historians reading these files today encounter a negative space, a shape defined by what is missing. It invites questions the past refused to answer. In that refusal lies the dread, the knowledge that something essential was seen, feared, and then buried, not because it was monstrous, but because it was undeniable. The records resume abruptly in 1841, when a clerk added a thin bundle of pages to the county archive, bound with twine and marked only by date. These pages concern repairs, transfers, and valuations, yet their tone differs from routine bookkeeping. The language grows cautious, verbs softened, nouns avoided. Something unnamed had entered the system and forced it to speak indirectly. Historians recognize this pattern well. When power feels watched, it disguises itself as procedure. The plantation, once confident, now documented itself like a witness afraid of testimony. Silence became its preferred method of control and survival within official memory. Beyond the papers, oral recollections preserved fragments that official ink refused to hold. Decades later, descendants spoke of a figure remembered not for deeds, but for atmosphere. He altered rooms without touching them. Conversations slowed when he passed. Children stared and were pulled away. Such memories were shared quietly, as if volume itself might resurrect danger. In slave societies, fear often attached itself to exceptions, to those who did not fit the script. His beauty, recorded nowhere, survived here as disturbance, a living contradiction no rule fully explained. Time only sharpened its edge inside communal memory across generations and regions. By the mid-1840s, economic pressures tightened and scrutiny increased from neighboring estates. Audits arrived unannounced, overseers were questioned. The plantation responded with transparency that felt rehearsed. Every asset was accounted for except one. A line item appeared repeatedly, marked incomplete, its value deferred. No name accompanied it. Scholars argue this absence indicates human property rendered unclassifiable, too volatile for open appraisal. In a world obsessed with measurement, refusal to measure signaled fear greater than loss. This was bureaucracy flinching before what it could not own even, while claiming absolute authority over bodies and lives within its domain alone. Personal correspondence from the mistress during these years adopts a peculiar restraint. Her letters describe gardens, weather, and distant relatives, yet avoid the household interior entirely. Earlier writings brimmed with domestic detail. The change suggests deliberate omission. Silence can be a form of authorship, shaping narratives by subtraction. What she refused to write reveals more than what she included. The beautiful slave existed as a gravitational absence, bending language around him, forcing expression into safer orbits. Fear learned to sound like civility and restraint like virtue. These habits protected reputations while corroding truth beneath polished phrases for posterity alone thereafter. The enslaved community responded differently, developing codes of reference that masked meaning while preserving it. Songs altered verses, proverbs gained double edges. A name might be replaced by a gesture, a glance, a pause. These were not acts of rebellion in the dramatic sense, but strategies of survival. Through them, the memory of the beautiful one remained mobile, resistant to capture. It slipped between generations like a shadow that could not be pinned to the wall. Such cultural encryption allowed truth to breathe quietly beneath domination. It waited patiently for listeners able to hear without destroying it entirely or ever. Outside scrutiny eventually receded, replaced by complacency. The plantation aged, its anxieties buried under routine, yet the unresolved presence lingered, shaping decisions in subtle ways. Marriages were arranged hastily, visitors were limited, certain rooms remained unused. These choices appear practical until viewed together. They form a pattern of avoidance, an architecture of denial built into daily life. What began as fear of scandal matured into an inherited silence, passed down like property. Each generation learned what not to ask and why curiosity carried consequences. Thus the secret endured, intact through restraint rather than force, waiting for history to listen again. Modern historians encounter this case obliquely, through gaps rather than declarations. The beautiful slave appears only as distortion, a ripple across otherwise calm documentation. Some dismiss this as coincidence, others argue it reveals the system's fragility. Beauty, when owned, exposed contradictions slavery could not reconcile. It demanded acknowledgement of humanity while denying it. The bizarre secret, then, was not his appearance alone, but the panic it provoked in those who relied on absolutes. Their world required fixed hierarchies, not mirrors reflecting suppressed truths. He became such a mirror, unbearable and therefore erased repeatedly from official sight and public memory alike. As this section closes, the archive remains unsettled. We are left not with resolution, but with tension preserved across time. The beautiful slave of Southern records resists narrative containment. His story survives as pressure, as absence that demands attention. In confronting it, we confront the methods by which history hides its most destabilizing figures. What follows will trace the final transformations of this silence and the costs exacted by keeping it intact. Those costs were borne unevenly, shaping lives never meant to be remembered. They echo still, faint yet persistent, within ledgers and whispers alike, waiting to be heard fully. The landscape itself bears indirect witness. Old trees lean toward the river as if listening. Foundations sink where unused rooms once stood. Archaeologists note disturbances without artifacts, impressions without objects. Such sites speak through absence, mirroring the archival condition. They suggest movement, concealment, care. The beautiful slave left no grave identified by name, yet the ground remembers passage. Soil keeps its own records, layered and patient, refusing the clean erasures preferred by men. Nature absorbs what history denies, holding truth beyond ink and stone. It waits for listeners willing to kneel and attend without ownership or domination over memory itself. This middle chapter settles not answers but weight. The bizarre secret grows heavier the longer it is unspoken. By tracing its contours, we feel the pressure it exerted on an entire social order. Beauty, humanity, and fear collided here, leaving marks that official narratives tried to smooth away. What remains is an unease that cannot be archived neatly. It presses forward, asking what other silences were constructed and who paid their price. The next section follows those costs into their final reckoning, where silence demanded consequence. Their history tightens and erasure reveals its human toll without mercy or retreat remaining. By the late 1840s, the silence surrounding the beautiful slave had hardened into policy. What had once been instinctive avoidance became deliberate erasure. Plantation ledgers were revised, margins scraped clean, names overwritten with ink darker than the original hand. This was not an attempt to forget, but to control how forgetting occurred. Memory was shaped like land, fenced and redirected. The absence grew intentional, maintained through effort and quiet coordination. Every system that relied on documentation learned to look past a missing figure and accept the gap as order rather than anomaly. Yet silence does not dissolve people, it merely displaces them. Accounts from neighboring plantations speak of a man whose arrival caused unease without explanation. Overseers described him as temporary labor, on loan, though no records confirm a formal transfer. He appeared, worked briefly, then vanished again, leaving behind unsettled rhythms. Tasks were completed too precisely, movements too measured. His presence was felt less in action than in reaction. Others watched him with a caution that felt rehearsed, as if they had been warned without being told why. This suggests the secret had begun to travel, carried indirectly through behavior rather than words. The enslaved community understood this movement differently. For them, he was not erased but redistributed, becoming a shared reference point rather than an individual story. His beauty was no longer described, it was implied through contrast. A song would mention a mirror refusing reflection. A folktale spoke of a river ashamed of its own clarity. These metaphors circulated quietly, preserving recognition while denying exposure. In this way, memory adapted to survive under pressure. It learned to bend, to travel light, to remain intact without names. Such resilience was not accidental, but born of long familiarity with loss. As decades passed, the plantation's economic power declined. Land changed hands, heirs argued, the old house aged into disrepair. With decline came vulnerability. New owners lacked the original fear, yet inherited its consequences. They sensed something unresolved, a tension embedded in the property itself. Rooms felt heavy. Visitors commented on an atmosphere they could not define. Attempts to renovate were abandoned. It was as though the structure resisted alteration, holding onto a past that refused transformation. This resistance was interpreted as superstition, yet it functioned as historical pressure, insisting on remembrance without revealing content. Legal documents from this later period reveal an unusual pattern of disputes over lineage and inheritance. Claims were filed, then withdrawn, testimonies contradicted themselves. Witnesses declined to elaborate. At the center of several cases lies an unnamed individual whose existence would have complicated established bloodlines. Beauty here intersects with power in its most dangerous form. To acknowledge him would require admitting proximity, intimacy, and humanity that law had worked tirelessly to deny. Thus the courts performed silence as rigorously as the plantations once had, preserving order through omission rather than judgment. The broader society participated as well. Local histories published at the turn of the century celebrated prosperity and refinement, yet avoided certain years entirely. When mentioned, those years were summarized vaguely, as transitional or unremarkable. This smoothing of narrative erased not just events but emotional truth. Pain, fear, and contradiction were considered unfit for commemoration. The beautiful slave, whose existence exposed the instability of racial hierarchy, was incompatible with celebratory memory. His story threatened to reveal that dominance relied not on certainty, but on constant suppression of inconvenient realities. Oral historians later encountered resistance when probing these gaps. Interviewees grew uneasy, voices lowering, stories diverting. Some denied knowledge while revealing it indirectly through caution. Others insisted nothing unusual had occurred, yet their insistence carried strain. Denial became performance, a learned response passed down like etiquette. This behavior demonstrates how deeply the secret embedded itself into communal identity. It shaped not only what was remembered, but how people learned to speak about the past. Truth became something approached sideways, never directly named, always felt. The beautiful slave's final fate remains undocumented. Some suggest he was sold far away. Others believe he was freed quietly, relocated beyond recognition. A few darker theories whisper of permanent removal. None can be confirmed. What matters is not the conclusion, but the uncertainty itself. It reflects a system unwilling to record outcomes that challenged its self-image. Closure would require acknowledgement. Uncertainty allowed denial to persist. Thus his story remains suspended, neither finished nor forgotten, existing in a liminal space between record and rumor, fact and fear. This suspension had consequences. It taught communities that silence could erase responsibility. It modeled how power avoids reckoning by withholding narrative. The beautiful slave became a lesson encoded in absence. That those who disrupt order may be removed without trace, and that their removal can be justified by forgetting. Such lessons did not remain confined to one story. They influenced broader practices of exclusion and erasure, shaping how history was written and who was deemed worthy of remembrance. Beauty in this context was not a gift but a liability, attracting attention that the system could not safely absorb. As this section closes, the secret no longer belongs to one plantation or one figure. It has diffused into structure, habit, and historical method. The bizarre nature of the story lies not only in what happened, but in how thoroughly it was concealed, and how that concealment became normalized. What remains is a haunting absence that demands examination. The next section will confront the long aftermath of this erasure, tracing how its echoes shaped generations and why the past still resists full disclosure. Silence once chosen does not end. It learns to survive. The aftershocks of the secret extended far beyond the original decade, settling into the soil of Southern memory like something buried too carefully to be accidental. By the mid-19th century, those who had directly known the beautiful slave were gone or aged into silence, yet their restraint endured. Children inherited it without explanation. They learned which questions drew glances, which names were never spoken aloud, which corners of family history ended abruptly. In this way, the secret did not fade with time, it matured. It became disciplined, structured, and self-protective. Plantation records from surrounding counties show an increased rigidity in language during the years following the incident. Descriptions of enslaved people became colder, more mechanical, stripped of distinguishing detail. Where once ledgers occasionally noted skill, temperament, or appearance, later entries reduced individuals to numbers and valuations alone. This was not coincidence, it was correction. Beauty had proven disruptive, reminding owners and institutions of humanity where they wished to see property. The response was to eliminate specificity, to prevent any future figure from exerting the same unsettling pull on conscience and hierarchy. The church, often the keeper of births, deaths, and marriages, also reflected this tightening. Registers grew sparse, baptisms were recorded without commentary. Mixed heritage children appeared briefly, then vanished from subsequent pages. Ministers wrote cautiously, aware that spiritual acknowledgement carried social consequences. Sermons from the period increasingly emphasized order, obedience, and divine hierarchy, framing inequality as sacred structure rather than human design. The beautiful slave's existence had threatened this narrative. The response was theological reinforcement, ensuring that faith aligned with suppression rather than compassion. Women of the household played a quieter but no less significant role in maintaining the silence. Letters between female relatives from the era reveal a coded awareness. Phrases like "that trouble" or "the matter we do not discuss" recur with striking consistency. These women were often the closest witnesses to domestic contradictions. The intimacy of shared space, the undeniable presence of resemblance, the unease of knowing more than could be admitted. Their silence was not passive. It was strategic, shaped by survival within a system that punished deviation harshly. By withholding acknowledgement, they preserved both status and safety. As the nation approached war, the unresolved past contributed to an undercurrent of anxiety. The institution of slavery was increasingly contested, yet defenders clung to narratives of control and propriety. Stories like that of the beautiful slave undermined these claims. They exposed intimacy, dependence, and contradiction at the heart of power. Thus such stories were buried deeper as tensions rose. When war finally came, it shattered records, displaced families, and provided convenient cover for long-standing erasures. What could not be defended ideologically was lost amid chaos. In the post-war years, memory fractured further. Reconstruction brought scrutiny, but also exhaustion. Communities eager to rebuild chose selective remembrance. They focused on loss and resilience, not complicity or hidden cruelty. Former plantations reinvented themselves, reframing history as nostalgia rather than reckoning. The beautiful slave did not fit this narrative. He represented a truth too complex for sentimental revision. As a result, he was excluded from both condemnation and commemoration, lingering instead in rumor and fragmented testimony. Oral accounts from the late 19th century suggest that his story survived most vividly among those least empowered to record it. Formerly enslaved people spoke of a man whose presence changed how others were treated, if only briefly. They recalled a shift in attention, a tightening of rules, a sudden severity where indulgence had once existed. These memories were shared cautiously, often in private, shaped by the understanding that truth could still be dangerous. Their accounts emphasized not spectacle but consequence. Beauty, they implied, had provoked fear more than desire. Historians encountering these accounts faced challenges of verification. Without written confirmation, such stories were often dismissed as exaggeration or folklore. Yet the consistency of themes across independent testimonies suggests otherwise. Each account describes disruption followed by repression, recognition followed by punishment. The pattern is unmistakable. It reveals a system reacting defensively to exposure, closing ranks to preserve illusion. The beautiful slave became less an individual than a catalyst, triggering mechanisms of control that extended far beyond his own life. The legacy of this response endured into modern historical practice. Archives inherited gaps without context. Scholars learned to navigate silence as evidence rather than absence. The missing name, the altered ledger, the sudden shift in language became clues rather than obstacles. Through such analysis, the contours of the story began to re-emerge. Not fully, not conclusively, but enough to suggest intention. The bizarre secret was not a single event, but a sustained effort to deny complexity in favor of dominance. As this section draws to a close, the focus shifts from the past's concealment to its persistence. The beautiful slave story survived because silence was imperfect. It leaked through behavior, structure, and consequence. What was hidden left traces everywhere. The next and final section will confront these traces directly, examining what it means to remember a life defined by erasure, and why confronting such secrets matters long after those who enforced them are gone. The final years of the record are the quietest, and in that quiet, the weight of what was never said becomes most apparent. By the time census takers and archivists returned to the county decades later, the plantation that once anchored the story had been renamed, subdivided, and softened by time. The house still stood, though altered, its sharp lines rounded by renovation and neglect. Visitors remarked on its calm. They felt nothing there, which was precisely the point. Places that have learned to hide do so convincingly. What remained was not a ghost in the popular sense, but an absence with shape. Documents that should have existed did not. Names that appeared once never appeared again. A birth was recorded without lineage, a transfer listed without destination. These omissions formed a pattern that resisted coincidence. Historians familiar with Southern records recognized it immediately. This was not lost through decay, it was lost through intention. The most telling evidence came from the margins. In ledgers otherwise pristine, ink darkened where names had been overwritten. In family Bibles, entire pages were removed, not torn but carefully cut. Even gravestones bore subtle inconsistencies, dates carved with hesitation, initials replacing full names. Each alteration suggested the same impulse: to reduce a life to something manageable, something that would not provoke questions. The beautiful slave had become a problem of memory, and memory had been disciplined. Yet despite these efforts, the story refused to disappear. It survived in fragments passed between generations who did not benefit from forgetting. Freedmen's descendants spoke of an ancestor whose face was remembered long after his name was lost. They described portraits hidden and later destroyed, not out of shame but fear. The resemblance was too precise. It threatened the fiction that bloodlines were clean, that power was unshared. These stories were not told loudly. They were told carefully, with an understanding of what silence had once protected and what it still could. In the early 20th century, scholars began to reconsider the meaning of such absences. Silence itself became an object of study. The beautiful slave story emerged not as a singular anomaly, but as part of a larger pattern of suppression common across the region. Beauty, when it crossed imposed boundaries, destabilized hierarchies. It forced recognition of shared humanity where division was essential to control. The response was always the same: erasure followed by moral rationalization. This realization reframed the narrative. The bizarre secret was not merely about one individual whose appearance unsettled those who claimed ownership over him. It was about a system exposed by its own contradictions. The insistence on categorization could not withstand complexity. The presence of someone who defied expectation revealed the fragility of the rules themselves. That fragility was intolerable, and so the story was buried. Today, the legacy of that burial remains visible in subtler ways. It appears in the discomfort that still accompanies discussions of intimacy and power in the historical South. It lingers in the reluctance to acknowledge how often proximity blurred lines that law insisted were absolute. The beautiful slave represents a truth that many would prefer to leave unnamed. That domination requires constant reinforcement precisely because it is never natural. What we are left with is not a complete biography, but a silhouette shaped by resistance. The man at the center of this story cannot be fully recovered, and perhaps that is the final cruelty. To be known only through the fear one inspired, rather than the life one lived. Yet even this incomplete remembrance carries weight. It challenges the comfort of clean narratives and demands attention to what has been deliberately obscured. In confronting this story, we are not restoring a name so much as acknowledging a choice. The choice to hide, to forget, to pretend that disruption never occurred. By tracing the contours of what was removed, we expose the labor required to maintain injustice. Silence, after all, does not happen on its own. It is built, maintained, and passed down like property. The beautiful slave of Southern records remains unidentified, but his impact is unmistakable. He altered behavior, language, and memory. He forced a system to react, to close ranks, to reveal itself through its defenses. That reaction tells us more than any surviving document could. It shows us what power fears most. Not rebellion, but recognition. As the archive finally falls quiet, one truth endures. History is not only what is written, but what is refused. The bizarre secret behind the most beautiful slave is not that he existed, but that so much effort was spent pretending he did not. And in that effort, the past left us a record of its own unease, etched not in ink, but in absence. If this story lingered in your thoughts, let it live a little longer. Like and subscribe for more forgotten voices.